Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, February 17th. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's broadcast editor, and your host this week. On the show, Russia says it has pulled back troops from the Ukrainian border, while Britain and America say that troops have, in fact, increased. Is this just another of Putin's tactics in the theatre of war? I'll speak to James Forsyth and the historian Robert Service. Do we miss a chance to befriend Russia when we had it? The country has seemed keen to join NATO at various points in its history. Might that have averted the current crisis? Rod Liddle will join the show. We'll turn to British politics next. Does it look like Boris has escaped the worst moment of peril? And what is the best play for Labour? I'll be speaking to Katy and Fraser Nelson. In this week's episode, we'll also be speaking to Lionel Shriver, who reviews the book Youthquake. As the rest of the world ages, author Edward Pace writes almost 60% of Africa's population is under 25, and that proportion will only increase. Lionel will be on to explain why that matters. And finally, the stats show that lesbian divorces are disproportionately high compared to gay men's. I'll speak to Julie Bindel to find out why. Before we get going, a very special thank you to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, who are sponsoring the Week in 60 Minutes. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who go above and beyond to offer you support and guidance. Just visit candowealth.com to find out more. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel too. Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. What exactly is going on the Ukrainian border? The Russians say they're withdrawing troops, while the West say they've added troops. Ukrainian banks have been subjected to anonymous cyber attacks this week, and there is talk of shelling and false flag attacks. In this week's cover piece, James Forsyth writes about Putin's options. To discuss, he joins me now with historian Robert Service, a biographer of Putin, Lenin, Trotsky and Stalin. James, it's been another week of will he, won't he, and our cover this week depicts Putin as the grand director of all of these theatrics. Are we any clearer on his next moves?
No, I don't think we are. And I think there is an interesting question about whether Vladimir Putin has decided what he is going to do next. I think he is clearly massed a military force that gives him a slew of options about what he wants to do. I personally think he is unlikely to opt for a kind of full-on invasion of the whole of Ukraine, because he knows that is something that would create the most unified Western response and the most stringent set of sanctions. I think, though, you can see some manoeuvring. Look at how he talks about what is happening in the Donbass. Absurdly, he claims it's a genocide. You've had reports on Thursday morning of mass graves being discovered and the like. And you can see that I think there is a possibility that he uses this Duma motion asking him to recognise the two breakaway republics in the Donbass as an excuse for, he goes in to offer protection there. And, that is something that I think it is less certain how unified the Western response to that would be.
And Robert, in this week's issue, we've also got the former World Affairs correspondent for the BBC, Paul Wood, writing, and he quotes some Ukrainian sources as saying that Putin is at the peak of his happiness because everyone is waiting on him in the way that James has described. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. I think one of his great motivations is to secure respect from the world. And the idea of having the British Foreign Secretary and the French and German equivalents rushing to plead their case with him in Moscow, that really is, double pudding course after a very, very thin gruel for the main course.
Well, ultimately, Robert, do you think he wants out of these tensions at the moment?
I think he wants a guarantee of a NATO-free Ukraine. That's been what he's banged on about since 2008, when he stepped down from the presidency in favor of his protege Medvedev. And that's what came through in June 2021, when at the Brussels NATO summit, it was decided to reoffer to Ukraine a step towards NATO membership. A month later, Putin made his attempt to totally reject that with the great long essay that he wrote or had written for him about how Ukrainians and Russians are really the same people.
And James, this week we're hearing more from, President Biden, from various Western sources that, Ukraine joining NATO was never really even on the cards. So do you think in some respect that Putin has already got what he wants?
So I think if you look at what Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, said in Moscow, he said, it's not on the agenda, Ukraine joining NATO. And so it would be absurd to have a kind of war over something that's not likely to happen. You've got Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, now talking about NATO membership as a dream rather than as something that is a kind of near-term prospect. I think there is an irony here, though, which is that Putin's decision to annex Crimea has changed the balance of Ukrainian politics. It has tilted Ukraine more towards the West than, and that is going to have a kind of lasting impact. And don't forget, it's not just NATO membership that Putin worries about when it comes to Ukraine. He doesn't want Ukraine joining the European Union either, because that's another thing that would anchor it in the Western orbit. And I think the problem for Putin is that Ukraine is increasingly looking west rather than east, and his own actions have compounded that, have catalysed that process, because he has essentially removed a large number of Russian speakers from the population of Ukraine by annexing Crimea.
And James, where does all of this leave the West now then? Because in your cover piece you write about sanctions. What kind of packages are we looking at?
So I think these sanctions will be far more severe than the sanctions that were imposed on Russia after 2014. I think that, the Biden administration has put a lot of diplomatic legwork into getting people to agree to what would be a properly punitive set of sanctions if there was a kind of full-blown Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, you can see the tensions in the alliance when Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, kind of complains to congressional Democrats that Germany needs kind of constant coaxing to agree to sufficiently strong sanctions. I think there are two complications with the sanctions approach. One is that Russia is better prepared in terms of its budgetary situation for these sanctions than before. And also China gives Russia other options. China is now increasingly an alternative market for Russian gas as it tries to transition away from coal. And secondly, if you look at some of the bars on technology exports to Russia that the US and the EU and Britain are considering, China could fill quite a few of those gaps for Russia. And then I think the second problem is that, when Joe Biden spoke to the American people on Tuesday, he was quite clear that if these sanctions were going to be stringent enough to deter Russia, they would have to also cause some pain in the West. That he warned Americans that they would be likely to make inflation worse, make gas prices go up more. I think we need to see European leaders preparing their publics for that, because if these sanctions are going to be tough enough and remain in place long enough to change Russia's behaviour, it would be foolish to think that they would be cost-free for the West. They would impose some pain on Western countries and Western publics, and Western leaders need to prepare their voters for that.
But James, just briefly, that's quite a hard political argument to sell, right? Because certainly in this country we're facing a cost of living crisis coming up in a couple of months already. Yeah,
it is a difficult crisis to sell, I think the argument needs to be made to people that if you let Russia change the boundaries by force, you are entering into a very dangerous era with the stability that we have taken in Europe in recent years for granted would be gone. Some people would say that that Crimea did that already in 2014. I think this would be a different order of magnitude, and I think that there is I think we have to, as a country, not to kind of, we have to, and as a Western order, we have to decide what kind of world we want to live in and what kind of world it will be if Russia gets away with simply annexing another chunk of Ukrainian territory or invading Ukraine and pulling down the government and putting in a pro-Russian government in its place. These things would be deeply destabilizing for Europe, and ultimately, I think the costs in terms of the defence budgets that would be required to deter Russia in future would be far greater than the cost of imposing really tough sanctions now.
Robert, what do you make of that then? And what kind of sanctions do you think would hurt Russia?
Well, we haven't really had a full range of effective sanctions so far. The Russians, after 2014, when Crimea was annexed, experienced sanctions, but they boasted that this had helped them to take decisions to regenerate their own domestic production. So they've continued to use Western financial facilities, basically London as a laundromat for their finance. There's not been very much done. So it would have to be done much more robustly than has so far been attempted. And the first agency that would suffer from this in the West would be the city, and then the pensions that spin off from the city. It would be a massive impact that we ourselves would experience. So it would be a big decision, and Putin knows that. Putin knows that. He knows also that the Germans need his gas.
And is that why it's important to get a united Western response then, to get those ambivalent Germans on side with the Brits and the Americans?
It's absolutely essential that Western interests come at Moscow in a united phalanx. The brilliance of Putin, insofar as he's been tactically brilliant, has lain in his capacity to divide the Western alliance, a Western alliance that was disrupted by a president in Donald Trump, who also wanted to break it up.
Well, how likely do you think that is, though, to get those interests to align? Because, as you say, Germans have a slightly different relationship there.
It's going to be very, very tough. And I'm not sure that we have in open sources the evidence that is as yet being achieved. But enough could be done, even as a halfway house, to make things very difficult for Russian so-called oligarchs. Oh, I do wish we would stop using that sloppy term. It really just means very, very rich businessmen with connections to the Kremlin, including the president himself. We could do a lot more than we're presently doing without getting 100% of the aims that we've been talking about achieved.
Yeah. And James, we're starting to see some of that in London, aren't we? Because Priti Patel has signalled that she is intending to stop some of that Russian money. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there's a golden visa scheme that essentially says if you're prepared to bring enough cash to the UK, we'll give you a visa. You know, the government is ending that. I think the government is talking about tougher sanctions on people with links to the Kremlin. And I think there is also an important point here, which is, you know, if the West is going to pursue this unified response, which is important for all the reasons that Robert outlined, you know, I think it helps if you can show that everyone is bearing some pain. I think it is easier to persuade Germany that it should not go ahead with Nord Stream 2 if you can show that the UK is also doing what it needs to do in terms of the City of London. And so I think a lot of this is about trying to demonstrate that the West is acting collectively, and the costs of sanctioning Russia are not falling all on one country. I think there is also a question here as well, which is, you know, in 2019, Russia spent 30% more on defence than the UK, France or Germany. I think that European defence spending has to increase, not only so that you can better deter Russia, but secondly, there's a big debate going on in Washington where some people are calling for a kind of Asia-first strategy, saying, look, you know, let the Europeans deal with Russia. Our big concern should be China. I think that you are going to struggle to keep the US involved in the European theatre unless you show that Europeans themselves are prepared to pull their weight on defence spending. So I think the Cold War peace dividend that, you know, nearly all European states took and then spent on their health or their welfare systems. That has come to an end, or needs to come to an end, and defence spending needs to increase across the board back to those Cold War levels.
But James, you talk about, for example, Nord Stream 2 ending it. When it comes to the context of China, wouldn't something like that just push Russian gas more into the Chinese market? And so isn't there a paradox here where the more we sanction Russia, the more we cut off economic interdependence between the two sides of the West and Russia, the more Russia gets pushed into the corner of China, which is a kind of reverse Kissinger, if you like?
Yeah, look, I think the rise of China and China's desire to transition from coal to gas gives Russia more options. I think the West can pursue energy independence in different ways. I think Emmanuel Macron's announcement of 14 new nuclear power stations in France by 2050 is one of the biggest contributions to European security we've seen in recent weeks. I think you can see much more done on small modular reactors. Again, nuclear as offering as an alternative to gas. But I think that the best way to deal with Russia and China is to reduce their leverage over the West by reducing your dependence on them.
Robert, what do you make of that? Because there are some in the foreign policy community who say that we should be peeling Russia away from China using a charm offensive.
Well, it's difficult to see how a charm offensive is possible at the moment, but in the long term, yeah. We have to be able to say to them, as they actually say privately among themselves anyway, that it doesn't really make sense for Russia to put all of its eggs in the Chinese basket. It makes the bargaining position of Russia so much weaker than it would be if Russia played off the West against China and vice versa. That's a much cleverer Kissinger type attitude. I mean, this is what Kissinger did in the 1970s. I mean, in readmitting China into the Western embrace, he created a fear in Moscow about the Chinese peril. So he played with China in that way. Well, a clever Russian ruler would be doing the same today, and it should be diplomatically possible to enable Russia to move towards that standpoint. There is a sort of self-interest, a Russian self-interest then, in enabling Russia to climb down from these terrible heights to which Putin has made it climb.
All right, James and Robert, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. I've got so many more questions, but we've only got so much time. Thank you. Could the crisis over Ukraine have been averted? In his column this week, Rod Liddle writes that we have had many chances to neutralise Russia's potential threat. They have all been passed up. To explain, Rod joins me now. Now, Rod, you write in your column this week that the current Russian aggression is something that the West has fostered and passed on opportunities to ameliorate. It's not a mainstream view, so can you explain it for us?
Well, it's very simple. Through the course of Russia's history, all the way back to the Kievan Rus and the formation of Russia, which was, of course, at the time Ukraine, Russia has periodically reached out to the West, desperate to be a part of the West at times, and has on almost every occasion been rebuffed. This has usually resulted in the Russians then retreating into a kind of Slavic and Asiatic redoubt, where they stress their differences to the West. And this certainly happened. It happened under the Tsars, and it's happened under the Soviet Union, and it's happening now. And the idea about joining NATO is the perfect example of this. In 2000, Vladimir Putin asked if Russia could join NATO, and was told, this is according to George Robertson, former Labour minister, of course, and former head of NATO, it was told rather airily by Robertson, we don't invite people to join NATO, you have to apply. This is Russia, this is Russia. And Vladimir Putin apparently said, in a very Putin-esque way, well, look, we're not going to stand in line with countries who mean nothing whatsoever, sort of thing. And so it never happened. And indeed, over the next 10 years, Putin became more and more distanced from the West and thought that the West was perfidious. But he wasn't the first. You know, he wasn't the first Ruski to suggest that Russia should join NATO. Boris Yeltsin in 1991 suggested that Russia should join NATO and did so again in 1993. And this was at a time when NATO was busy swallowing up Poland and countries like that. And in fact, Yeltsin supported Poland's membership of NATO, much to the distress of the former commie hardliners who were still hanging around in the country. And then in 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev proposed that Russia should one day very soon join NATO. But the US Secretary of State at the time said that this was merely a dream and shouldn't be entertained. And so we've had all these overtures from the Russians and have rejected them each time. The first one, I mean, arguably the most interesting one, and one which probably had a bit of mischief attached to it as well, was back in 1953, the height of the early Cold War, when Molotov, who was Russian foreign minister at the time, also said, look, we'd like to join this new organization, NATO. We think it would be of cardinal importance for peace throughout the world and particularly security in Europe. And it's interesting because at the time, Winston Churchill was very, very much in favor of rapprochement with the Soviet Union, much to the annoyance of Eisenhower and the American administration. And Churchill kept pushing for a summit meeting with Khrushchev, who was newly installed, or indeed Malenkov, who preceded Khrushchev, and that there should be this big summit meeting with Eisenhower, Churchill, and the Soviet premier, and that this would lead to a thawing of relations and the threat of worldwide annihilation receding. But he was always rebuffed on that occasion by the Americans. So there has been a history. Even then, even in the Cold War, Russia was asking to join NATO.
Well, Rod, is fascinating because I certainly didn't know about any of these attempts, and I think it's interesting that people in the West don't tend to hear about these overtures, as you've called them. But do you think that we should take any of these moves seriously? Because how much of it is, as we would say in the millennial generation, trolling? You know, how much of it is mischievous and teasing NATO and Western alliances?
I think there was some mischief with Molotov, because this was at the time, 1953. NATO was very, very new. It had been in existence a year, I think, and there were questions about whether the US should be in NATO. And Molotov was arguing that both the US and Russia should be in NATO. And there was probably a bit of mischief involved there, sure. But there was no mischief involved with Gorbachev, none whatsoever, and certainly none with Yeltsin, nor was there any with Putin. If you think back to 2000, Russia being accepted into NATO we would be in such a stronger position today if Russia was in NATO. We wouldn't have had the problems over Ukraine, and we would have had a very, very solid bulwark against China and indeed radical Islam, all of which, you know, Putin has previously acknowledged that things which we and Russia have in common. But we rejected it, and we've always rejected it, and we've rejected it, you know, over the last 800 years. What we've tended to do instead is meddle in Russian affairs, in Soviet affairs. Back in 1917, we tried to crush the revolution, invade the country. Russia has been invaded by Germany, of course. It was invaded by Napoleon. And that's kind of been the way that the West has responded to the Russians. So you can see when people talk about the Russians being paranoid about NATO swallowing up the likes of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, that it feels as if it's encircled. Well, it is encircled. And that paranoia has long, long roots in history. And I just think we have to remember that. I have no truck with Putin at all. And I think we have to stand up for Ukraine on this occasion. What I'm talking about is the history between our two great blocs, the vast Russian Empire and Western Europe. Russia has tended to be more sinned against than sinning.
Do you think that, I think your point on China is particularly interesting, and I do agree with you that what we seem to be doing right at the moment is pushing Russia closer to China, and it's something that I've been talking about on Spectator TV just now with James Forsyth and the historian Robert Service as well. But, during the Cold War, Nixon was able to peel China away from Russia and overlook China's kind of communist ideology. But do you think ideology stands too much in the way now between the West and Russia? So could the West really peel Russia away now, given the rhetoric on both sides, and given that Putin is not really a democrat, is he?
No, he's not. He's an autocrat and an authoritarian. But the point you raise is interesting because I can see NATO eventually, back in 1953, said no to Russia, the Soviet Union joining, for reasons of democracy. In other words, they said the Soviet Union, that was an ideological difference, that the Soviet Union couldn't be part of it for ideological reasons. And you can see that. That seems to me to make sense. Of course, by 1990, 1993, there was no ideological difference. Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to turn Russia into kind of Sweden, and Yeltsin the same. Now, and it would have been the same in 2000 as well, where Russia was not yet the authoritarian state which it is today. But since that rebuff, Russia has done what it's tended to do at times, is look for allies elsewhere, and it's retreated exactly as it used to do in the past into its Asian roots, which means Asian-style democracy, i.e. not what we would call democracy at all, the persecution of political opponents, but equally a move away from what Putin considers to be the Western ideology at the moment, which is the culture wars. So Putin is very clearly on one side of the culture wars. I have to say I'm on the same side as him when it comes to the culture wars. I think one of the best one of the best speeches I read in the last couple of years was Putin's about what the West is doing to itself, and he likened the policing of the culture wars in the West to what happened under Stalin in the Soviet Union, and I'm with him all the way on that. But I'm not with him all the way on murdering political opponents and gerrymandering elections. I think that's pushing it a bit. But you're right that there is now a greater ideological divide between us and Russia and indeed China, than there has been since the end of the Cold War.
Well, Rod, lots of food for thought. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And to hear more about this burgeoning Russia-China alliance, you can listen to my podcast, Chinese Whispers, where I deal with exactly this question. Link is on the screen. Now to Westminster. The Metropolitan Police is continuing its investigation into parties held in Downing Street during lockdown, yet in some ways it does seem like Boris Johnson has managed to cling on. What is the political situation now? I'm joined by The Spectator's editor, Fraser Nelson, and our deputy political editor, Katy. Now, Katy, apart from Ukraine and Russia dominating attention this week, Boris Johnson also tried to have a tour in Scotland. Can you tell us about what he was trying to do there? Was that a levelling up thing or was that a devolution thing?
So this was the Levelling Up tour. I think what's interesting is right now everything is seen through the prism of Boris Johnson's position, his weakened position as Prime Minister. And I think there are a few things that a Prime Minister can pull out the bag if you're trying to look as though you're very in control without doing anything that might reveal your lack of support, your dwindling support amongst your party. So we had a mini reshuffle this week. I remember many tours under Theresa May. But this was Boris Johnson going to Scotland to talk about levelling up, talking about free ports. But I think what was tricky for Boris Johnson was it actually, in its own way, revealed one of his weaknesses, which is his lack of support amongst his own side in Scotland. So Boris Johnson cut quite a lonely figure on his visit because Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, did not meet him. This is the same Douglas Ross who has called on Boris Johnson to resign, backed by Ruth Davidson, the former Scottish Conservative leader, and the bulk of MSPs have also shared their concerns over his position. And therefore, I think the fact that he was there by himself, as to Jack, the Scottish secretary, who ultimately does support the Prime Minister and was away so couldn't join him, just highlighted the fact that he is at loggerheads with his party north of the border.
Fraser, what is the best way for Boris Johnson to handle this problem of his, which is his lack of popularity in Scotland? Because for people like Douglas Ross, it's actually quite good for them, isn't it, to distance themselves from Boris?
Good for them, but not brilliant if you're a unionist party, where even you are saying that you don't think the Prime Minister should be governing Scotland or indeed any other part of the UK. It's difficult to work out what Boris Johnson's options are. I mean, I gather that he sent a handwritten birthday card to Douglas Ross a couple of weeks ago as a kind of rapprochement. In return, the Scottish Tories have said they might allow the Prime Minister to address their conference in a video link. Previously, he was going to be banned completely. But it is, I think, obviously ridiculous and plays straight into the SNP's agenda to have the Scottish Conservatives at war with the Conservative Party leader. I think, whenever a Prime Minister gets in trouble, there's a lot of temptation for people to jump on the bandwagon and say, you should go now. But the difficulty is, what happens if the guy doesn't go now? What happens if Boris Johnson stays for a year, 2 years? What happens if he makes it to the next election? You've now got not just Douglas Ross, but pretty much every single Scottish member of the Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament having signed a letter saying that Boris Johnson is not fit to be Prime Minister. Pretty difficult for those guys to go and campaign for him to win the next election if it comes to that. So I think it's a huge mess, put it that way, and a mess which stands only more cruelly exposed after the events of this week.
And Katy, let's talk about the peril that the Prime Minister had been in and which triggered a lot of these statements from Scottish Tories. But it does seem like Partygate is taking a bit of a backseat given Ukraine and also recess. So what's the latest with that?
Yeah, I think you can look at the current situation. There is definitely a sense of calm. You can see the poll lead Labour have enjoyed recently has gone down. The gap is narrowing. There's an average of 6-point lead now that Labour have over the Tories. And you're hearing more MPs say, oh, well, maybe Boris Johnson can get through this. But I also think we have to think of this from, you can look at this in different ways. And one of the issues here is it's recess and there's a really serious foreign policy situation. Ultimately, Partygate has not gone away. Lots of people watching this may be a bit bored of talking about parties, but the fact that there is a police investigation, Boris Johnson could still, receive a penalty fixed notice. He could receive a fine. That would bring things up again. There are lots of Tory MPs who will move if that happens. And even if he doesn't, there's a question of did he mislead the Commons and things he said about parties, and there's a question of whether the full Sue Gray report would be published, which could reopen the wound. So I think he is not out of the woods yet, even if I think that he has bought himself time, space, and is using that to do various things to look as though he is in control. And when it comes to that investigation, the police investigation, there are a few briefings out this week, probably quite misguided briefings. The Financial Times reports Boris Johnson allies effectively saying that he will be fine, he will not get a fine. I'm not sure how they would know that yet. We know the Prime Minister has a survey at the moment which needs to fill in with his lawyers, because I am reminded of a briefing a few weeks before the Sue Gray report by friends of Boris Johnson, which effectively said that the report would be fine because it would not find any potential criminal wrongdoing and there would be no police investigation. And look how that aged.
And Fraser, you wrote recently that, whisper it, Boris Johnson might still survive this. How do you see that happening?
Oh, quite easily. I mean, let's admit that right now he has made it till half-term. A lot of people thought he wouldn't get to this stage, but Parliament has broken up without any successful attempt to depose him. The kind of the dramatic supply of ammunition has seized up as well. We've had several days have gone now without any new photograph of a party or tinsel or open packet of crisps or anything like that. But these things were beginning to lose their impact anyway. Plus, he's got a reasonable chance of turning the page and talking about how he's going to recover from COVID. So we've now, pretty much abolished all of the restrictions in the UK. Some still to go, especially in the devolved parts of the country. But soon, free testing will probably be brought to an end as part of the pandemic recovery. Anybody can come to Britain now. They almost have abolished the restrictions. If you're unvaccinated, you still got to take a test. But he can talk a lot about what he's going to do to get the country back on the road. Now, sure, you've got cost of living and various other issues, but I think he's got a chance to seize the momentum and just keep going. The other thing that we've seen, which I think we don't mention often enough, is just how relatively useless his antagonists are. Where is their candidate? Is Rishi Sunak ready? Is Liz Truss ready? No, neither of them are. Everybody wants to wait for somebody else to do something. So the Tories wander around saying, who's got names to depose Boris Johnson? Do we have the 52 names? They don't ask if you've got the 180 names you would need to actually get rid of him as leader, or even how successful an attempt on his premiership would be. So right now, I think the Prime Minister is blessed in his enemies. He's certainly blessed in having Tory plotters who are not very good at plotting. And as Katy says in her excellent political column in the New magazine, he's also blessed in having Keir Starmer, who is always there for him when he most needs him.
Now, Katy, let's talk about that column then, because it does seem like Keir Starmer has saved Boris Johnson's bacon a few times. But you write this week that may not be an accident.
Yeah, I think there have been a few points when actually critics of Boris Johnson have, on his own side, have been quite exasperated by what they see as Keir Starmer helping the Prime Minister. And I think there is no example more acute, because there have been cases on COVID legislation, you think about vaccine passports, where Boris Johnson had to rely on Labour votes. But I think the most acute example was a few weeks ago when there was a day where really it did seem as though Boris Johnson could face a confidence vote. The 2019 intake members of that had met. It was known as the pork pie plot, and on the morning of Wednesday there was really a sense that Graham Brady was about to hit the number of letters required and there would be an announcement after Prime Minister's questions. Then all of a sudden you had Christian Wakeford announced as defecting to Labour, moving to be from a Tory MP to a Labour MP, one of the 2019 intake, and it just had this rallying effect where this tribal instinct kicked in with Tory MPs, and lots of people thought, well, Keir Starmer has blown this by doing this defection at this point. He's actually, led the Tories to unite and stop them from ousting Boris Johnson. The threat subsided. And I think what's interesting was Keir Starmer really hopeless and not realising how that would work, or actually is there something else that's going on here, which is it's quite helpful in a way from the Labour perspective to have a wounded Boris Johnson staying in position, and that's certainly how senior figures in Labour feel, that ultimately a wounded Boris Johnson is pretty good for them. And you can see where they're coming from if you look at recent polls. The question is, how long does that remain the case? Does Boris Johnson bounce back? And are the other candidates really, bad news for Labour or not?
Fraser and Katy, thank you for joining Spectator TV. In the book section of this week's magazine, Lionel Shriver reviews Youthquake, Why African Demography Should Matter to the World. By 2035, Africa will have a larger workforce than India and China. By the end of the century, the continent will likely have a population of over 4 billion and be the birthplace of half of the world's under-18s. What does this population boom mean? Lionel is on the show. Lionel, to start with, tell us about the exception to global trends that is Africa.
Well, UN population projections have been consistently assuming that all over the world birth rates will steadily drop in the same way that they did in the Western world. But their projections for Africa have not been holding, and unlike everywhere else in the world, in the last 20 years, the UN has had to revise its projections for Africa upwards, which they haven't done anywhere else. And there are countries like Nigeria where women are just on average having over 5 children, and they continue to have over 5 children. And those children are, in vast majority, living to adulthood and also having 5 children. And, there's a kind of cultural presumptuousness in Western assumptions that everyone's the same and everyone will do as Westerners have done. And it's just not turning out that way. And there are huge consequences for not only how many people we have in the world, say at the end of the century, but where they are.
Now, is that boom that's coming, or maybe we're seeing it already, is that because Africa has so far been behind the economic development, or at least in modern times, compared to other continents? So it hasn't had that kind of dipping off yet when you get a little bit richer, perhaps?
I don't think it's that simple. There isn't a linear relationship between development and birth rate. We've been assuming there is. This is more of that cultural presumption. And we've also assumed that if you educate women, the birth rate will plummet, or that if you have increased urbanization, which Africa does, the birth rate will plummet. None of this is holding true. You know, the Africans are not obeying the rules, which makes it demographically a very interesting continent. What fascinated me most of all about this book, and I should say it's a good book up to a point. It has a lot of interesting information. It's very detailed. If you are interested in demography, and you are interested more broadly in how the numbers shake out for the human race this century, it's an excellent resource, and most of it is quite up to date. That's the problem with demographic books in general, because they date quickly. All the figures are, you know, if they're even 10 years old, they're kind of useless. But the author peculiarly pulls back from the very subject that will motivate people to buy the book. After all, for the most part, this is not a book written for Africans. It's in English, and it is addressing a Western audience. So why would, especially Europeans and Westerners more broadly, why would they be so fascinated with the demographics of a continent that most of us won't end up going to? I've been there, but that makes me generally the exception. What's the source of the fascination?
Well,
duh! Immigration. And the author just dismisses it as if it's just some fetish of the West, and as if we're not already seeing huge pressure on European borders, specifically from Africa. And I found that politically fascinating. I found it a little cowardly, and I also found it commercially perverse. I mean, this is your selling point, and you don't want to talk about it.
What do you think that it's, the refugee crisis that we're having at the moment, isn't it more to do, I mean, I don't really know much about it, but isn't it more to do with war and civil or otherwise than to do with a large population needing more room, as it were?
I don't think space is the issue. It's prosperity, and it will increasingly be water. There are countries that are suffering from drought and high population growth, and your cattle are dying, and your sons want to go to Europe, and I think that's going to be increasingly the case. I do anticipate enormous pressure from Africa, and it's mostly to do with life being kind of crap, if right? And I should add, I'm sympathetic. I mean, why should you put up with life being kind of crap if it's better elsewhere? That's what makes immigration so morally fascinating for me, because it's hard to make a moral case for telling people who are going to thrive in your country more than in theirs that they can't come. Yeah. We can put together a scenario whereby, if you allow uncontrolled illegal immigration to pour into your country, then eventually the very benefits that immigrants are seeking are diluted or eliminated. I mean, you can't afford a welfare state if you have too many people signing on. It's as simple as that.
Well, I do wonder if, in the timescales that we're talking about, because I think one figure you had was there will be over 4 billion Africans by the end of the century. So obviously that's still 8 decades away. In that time, with the population boom that we're talking about, especially with a rebalancing of society towards younger demographics, that could be a great economic boom for the continent, couldn't it? I mean, if you look at China, they're worried about not enough young people. And what we're seeing Africa is a reverse of that situation. So it could be that by the end of the century that Africa is the economic centre of the world.
Well, yes, that is the optimistic picture. Of course, just because I'm a natural catastrophist, this is not my favorite scenario. The biggest constraint right now on this cheerful picture of Africa becoming, the great labor force of the world, and I guess in this version of events they stay put, is education. And the education levels are appalling. And one of the problems with African education is population growth, because even countries that pour more resources into education, they're barely keeping up with the numbers. So they're not actually improving anyone's education. They're just barely managing to give a little bit of education to vastly more people. And I should point out, and this is one of the things I found really shocking about the book, we're not talking about a low level of issuance of PhDs, or even, community college. In many countries, the majority of Africans are not graduating from primary school. And if you actually look at what they're learning, rather than what grade they have technically graduated from, there are countries where the average level of education is 1 to 2 years of primary school. And that really tarnishes this happy, cheery picture, because, the labor force of the future, or for that matter of the present, that is going to be needed is educated, is skilled. And we're talking, unless there's a fantastic revolution, I guess I can't rule it out, a large proportion of the continent being functionally illiterate. And that's not the labor force that's going to, be the powerhouse of the world.
Yeah. Well, Lionel, let me play devil's advocate here for my final question, because we're talking about demography. And in your review as well, you mentioned China a couple of times. What you described just now with education levels not keeping up with population growth, that's the kind of argument that growing up in China I heard a lot about in defense of the one-child policy. People saying, in the 1980s, China had no choice, it was still very, very poor, not just education, but healthcare and other things just couldn't keep up with, the fertility rate, which at that time was 5 children per 1 woman. So, are you sympathetic to that argument that, you might have to limit your population growth in order for these public services to increase? And now literacy rate in China is 95%, whereas in 1980 it was 2/3.
I've read a fair bit about the one-child policy in China, and one of the big surprises for me is that the total fertility rate was already dropping precipitously by the time they brought in the one-child policy. And there's a lot of evidence that China would have followed the classic demographic transition of the West without state coercion. And it is really interesting that the state coercion has been too successful. Yeah. And I was gobsmacked by that statistic that I included in the review, which the author of Youthquake includes in passing, that on current demographic trends, the population of China is likely to peak at 1.5 billion. It's already over 1.4, so it's not going to get much bigger. And by the end of the century, we'll go down to 500 million, a third of what it is today. And that is going to be the biggest check on Chinese power, because that's where their power comes from, is sheer numbers, and those numbers are able to generate enormous earnings for the country so that it can throw its weight around with money. But from now to 2100, also, they're going to have to deal with a huge change in age structure. China has the same problem the West has, but it's worse because they're going to have a bunch of old people, a bunch of old, sick people. That's what I'm about to become.
Well, also the problem in China is that retirement age for men is 60 and for women is 55. So, you're getting people retiring very, very early as well, which doesn't help.
Just like France.
Right. So you can see the Chinese government being quite worried by expanding the one-child policy to 2-child to now 3 children, which is essentially no child policy at all, because that's what average fertility is anyway. But it doesn't seem to be working, as you say.
Yeah, well, I find what's going to happen to China just desserts. It gives me a lot of pleasure. I hope you don't take that personally.
No, I don't take that personally. As a Chinese person, I hope that means everyone on average will have better standards of living, rather than having to live in an overpopulated country.
Yes, I mean, it's possible that China with only 500 million people will be a happier place.
Possibly.
And a more prosperous place.
Yeah, there's a lot of ifs going on between now and the end of the century, but yeah.
Well, we are so used to viewing any form of growth as good that whenever we're presented, for example, with the notion that European populations are going to contract, it's regarded as this is terrible. We're losing power. Life is going to get horribly worse. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, a lot of European countries could probably thrive with slightly fewer people in them. I think what we tend to spin forward, of course, is a terror that that trend continues, and therefore everyone disappears.
Right. Or that you don't have enough for productivity in the economy. But I think it's interesting that in China, people think that there are too many people as well. So there are moves to raise the retirement age, but there are people currently in the labour market, younger generations like myself, who don't want that to happen because they already have so much competition in the existing working age population. So I think a lot of Chinese people are also thinking maybe fewer of us are better as well. Anyway,
well, we have the failure to think long term in aggregate is that Chinese people are having, say, at best, one child, and what that one child is going to have to support you, so in socially speaking. That one child is going to have to support the 2 parents. And that's pretty hard on the kid.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, Lionel, plenty more to talk about, but we'll have to leave it here for now. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And finally, between 2014, when gay marriage became legal, and 2020, 3 times the number of lesbians have divorced compared to gay men. Why is there such a discrepancy? The writer and feminist Julie Bindel writes in this week's issue that divorcing lesbians could be realising that marriage is, as she puts it, a patriarchal institution that has curtailed women's freedom for centuries. Julie joins me now. Julie, welcome to Spectator TV. Tell us about why you think lesbians are divorcing in higher numbers then.
Well, women in traditional sort of heterosexual relationships, overwhelmingly it's women that instigate divorce, and usually for issues relating to domestic abuse, domestic violence. Now, although obviously there are some instances of domestic violence or coercive control in same-sex relationships, in lesbian relationships, it's a far smaller number, far smaller. The vast majority of perpetrators of domestic abuse and coercive control are men against their female partners. And so it's easier for women to decide to end a relationship without fear of reprisal. If you look at domestic homicide rates, that is, women who are killed by men, by former or current male partners, one woman dies every 3 days. And the majority of those women die when they attempt to leave or have left a relationship. So many women will falter, will decide not to instigate divorce or go through divorce proceedings because of the fear of reprisal. And also, of course, as we see in the family courts, where there's children involved, there are bitter, often, tragic custody battles being fought, usually through spite, instigated by an abusive former male partner. So none of those factors, or rather very, very rarely do those factors come in when we're talking about lesbian relationships. But the other issue is, of course, that lesbians are used to not being able to marry. I mean, unless we're talking about very young lesbians who came of age in 2014 or after that. So I'm 59 years old and I've been a lesbian, since my teens. And most of the time that I've been a lesbian and had lesbian relationships, it just would never have occurred to us that we could marry and that would ever be a legal possibility. And so we have been very much used to, usually, ending relationships without the nightmare of going through a divorce as and when the relationship, has ended, is no longer happy.
Well, there are a lot of things that you pick up there, and I just want to pick up on the first part you mentioned, which is this point about domestic abuse and coercion. And I can hear viewers now thinking, I just want to clarify one point, which is that you're not saying that there is no domestic abuse in lesbian marriages or that all gay marriages have domestic abuse. You are saying it's a numbers thing, it's a statistical thing that men are more likely, or statistically domestic abusers are more likely to be men, and people who feel coercively controlled are more likely to be victims of men.
Yes, totally. And every single piece of credible research has shown the fact that the most common scenario within coercive control and domestic violence and abuse is that perpetrated by a man against a woman in a heterosexual relationship. And again, that's the most common issue cited in divorce proceedings taken by women. Now, of course, there are small numbers of lesbian relationships where there is domestic abuse, coercive control, domestic violence featured, but it's relatively rare.
It's interesting. And let's talk about that point that you also make about marriage being relatively new for lesbians and gay men, which is, this question about whether people are doing it. That you mentioned this flurry of weddings that you attended when it first became legal for gay marriage to happen. Do you think people jumped into it because finally they could?
I didn't attend them. I
But you got so many invites.
I got the invites, a flurry of invites.
Why
I
didn't you
don't like
go?
weddings. I don't like weddings. And as a feminist, I'm deeply critical of the institution of marriage. And as a feminist, my tradition has always been to critique marriage as a patriarchal institution rather than saying, can we please have a seat at the table? I'm a great believer in civil partnerships for all and the abolition of marriage to separate, obviously, the relationships, personal relationships, from religious institutions and to a large extent the state. But I think that what happened when civil partnerships became possible through a change in the law in 2005 was that many women got very, and of course gay men, but women in their droves got very excited about the idea of being able to publicly acknowledge their relationship in a formal way. And I think for many of those women, it gave them a sense of legitimacy. Of course, there is still, despite equality under the law, horrendous prejudice towards same-sex couples. And for many of those women, they thought that it legitimized them, as far as their family members, for example, their neighbors, their work colleagues were concerned. And it's true, lesbians often are seen as not having a legitimate relationship. compared to heterosexuals. If you look back at Section 28, which was a pernicious piece of legislation introduced under the Thatcher government, where it became, it was outlawed in schools to speak of same-sex relationships or gay or lesbian identity in any way other than negative. And that has since been repealed thanks to campaigning. But if you think about what that legislation did, it suggested that children shouldn't be taught about pretend families. And what they meant was our relationships, and particularly if we were raising children. So although I'm deeply critical of marriage and only entered into a civil partnership with my partner because we have caring responsibilities for an adult, we own a home together, so we want next of kin rights. I was never minded to join in marriage for romantic reasons, but definitely many women just went berserk. I mean, the taffeta was flying all over the place, the bunting, the kind of practicing their first dance, all of that traditional, the traditional trappings of marriage were taken on board by many women. Some tried to do it differently in a less orthodox way, but the only blueprint available was, of course, the heterosexual wedding, which is grotesque in my view, whichever way you look at it and whoever's getting hitched.
So do you think that this current rise in lesbian divorces comes from because there was a spike in lesbian marriages at that point, and maybe it will be a one-off thing as the LGBT community gets used to the idea of gay marriage, certainly in this country, a bit more, it becomes less of a thing to rush into?
I think so, but also, like I say, if you remove the barriers to divorce, then more people would get divorced, because there are lots of unhappy relationships out there and people staying together because of the hassle of separating. Maybe the kind of excitement about marriage will die down, but ultimately, women, all of us, have socialized into thinking that marriage is the ultimate state, that our relationship somehow is improved by marriage, which is something that I just don't accept at all.
So when the whole gay marriage debate was going on then, and now as well, what did you make of it? Do you think that it was a bit of a useless debate to be having, given your position on marriage? Or do you think, each to their own, if people want to get married, then they should be able to?
Oh, of course they should. And it's outrageous that certain sections of society were prevented from doing something that heterosexuals had, been doing since the beginning. It would be like saying that everybody can marry, but Jews can only have civil partnerships. It's clear discrimination. It's clear inequality, and I'm not anti-equal marriage. I'm anti-marriage per se. But to answer your question, when the debate was raging, I think it was quite useful because it really dug some of the bigots out of the woodwork. We were being likened to child abusers. It was, marrying someone of the same sex was compared to bestiality. It was, there were jokes about, well, you may as well have a post box marrying your vacuum cleaner. It was pretty horrendous. And of course, the church had to really, and all the religious institutions really had to clean up their act. But I still thought the amount of time, money, and effort put into bolstering the institution of marriage, which feminists, I think, should be critical of, should have been spent on our homeless youth, for example, or rooting out sexual exploitation, within some sections of the commercial gay scene. We have much bigger fish to fry, much bigger, deeper problems than whether or not we can dance to Lady in Red and eat coronation chicken at an event, really. But of course, it's wrong that certain sections would be denied the opportunity of marriage.
Julie Bindel, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. That's it for this week. Once again, we're delighted that Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management is sponsoring the week in 60 minutes. Canaccord will provide the expertise you need to build your wealth with confidence. You can visit candowealth.com to find out more. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to The Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.